Hi, my name is Esther, and I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Debbie, pronouns she, her.
And this is our podcast, Spirits Rising, where we question everything we've been taught about faith.
Listen to our unfiltered discussions with awesome guests as we explore liberating spiritualities true to our experiences.
So today we have two guests from Generous Space.
Generous Space is an organization that works to dismantle religious-based harm, pursue intersectional justice, and celebrate LGBTQ2+ lives in both the church and our world. Their vision is to see LGBTQ people flourish in life-giving Christian community and in their spiritual journeys.
Our guests today are Becca Sawyer, she, her pronouns, Ontario Director of Community for Generous Space, and Michiko Bown-Kai, they, them pronouns, who is a program assistant with Generous Space, as well as a United Church minister and SCM U of T alumni.
I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves in 3 questions. So the first one is, what have you eaten today? What is your involvement in Generous Space? And the last question is, what are you passionate about? I'm gonna ask Becca to go first, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. I didn't have breakfast today, so the first thing I ate was English muffin mini pizzas that I ate very quickly before this call. They were very yummy. So that's what I've eaten today. My involvement with Generous Space, like you said, I'm the Director of Community in Ontario, so that means I do a whole bunch of stuff. I get to help support our volunteer facilitators that run local Generous Space groups. I get to do admin and program stuff when it comes to our 3 retreats that we have across Canada every year, pre-pandemic. And I also get to be involved in some consultant work, so doing workshops or speaking at churches and having dialogue and conversation with folks about discerning if they can draft an affirming statement, or just how to make their churches or organizations more inclusive for LGBTQ plus folks. And what I'm passionate about is a lot of things, but these days, I think because of COVID and the isolation that a lot of folks are experiencing, I've been connecting a lot with LGBTQ plus folks that are just starting to give voice to their identities or what they're finding out about themselves, and are in those beginning stages of trying to figure out who are safe people to talk to, or where they can go to find other community. And so I've gotten to connect with a lot of those folks recently, and I'm really passionate about help, like getting to talk to people at that stage in their queer journey and connect them with other people that have been there and can be possibility models for them. That's been my passion these days.
That's good. And I'm craving English muffin mini pizzas. How about you, Michiko?
Yeah, there's something about the muffins, like doughiness, that's just, I love pizza, but there's something about those that are just like particularly awesome. Hi everyone, my name is Michiko, and I'm joining you from the land of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and Attawandarak people. So this is land and waters that are part of the Haldimand Treaty and known colonially as Cambridge, Ontario. Like was said previously, I'm a minister in the United Church of Canada. What else should I say about me? I'm queer, I'm exhausted. Food that I've had today, I just had a fried egg, which is, always a good meal. I joined Generous Space last year in January. I was brought on to do some particular programming around community building and outreach for Black, Indigenous, and people of color that are part of or connected to Generous Space. I work part-time, so that has been some fulfilling yet a sort of smaller piece of the larger ministry I'm doing these days.
So I imagine all of us know people who have left the church because of heterosexism. And I'm always curious about the reasons that queer people choose to stay. Being a queer Christian leader actively involved in dismantling heterosexism in the church takes a really profound commitment. And I'm wondering if you could each tell us a bit about your personal history with faith and with church, and what led you to the work that you're doing now?
Awesome question. And I think for me, it's about like integrity, right? And knowing where you are in a place and having community and those that love and support you be able to help negotiate this is like an ongoing discernment. So I really rely on people to help me figure out what are good spaces and not good spaces in terms of ministry, in terms of community in general. But in terms of like accepting a call to ministry and all those things, I think it was that I really felt in particular like church in its very definition, that it was supposed to be a project of social justice and liberation. And because of that, it was important that it was held accountable for that vision. And there was a sense that, the cost is just too high when what happens when the church fails is that it's a spiritual type of harm and violence that happens. And that, there are other spaces where people can go and, figure things out. But I really think that, your spirituality should be something that you can access in community, and that being part of community is so important, which is why I thought there was a particular need to be doing this kind of work. Yeah, and I think also for me, like what I've realized over the years is that being queer is how I'm Christian, and being Christian is how I'm queer, and those things are so connected that I can't imagine trying to live them out separately.
I loved what you just said, Michiko, about being queer is how you're Christian and Christian is how you're queer, and I resonate with that a lot too. I grew up born and raised in the Pentecostal church, and so from my experience, queerness, there was some explicit statements made throughout my life about queerness being sinful or wrong, but it was mostly the covert stuff that in the messaging that I got growing up. So queerness wasn't even like an option for me as like something that could be part of my story or could be something that I could explore. And so I think once I started down that journey of realizing my own queerness and getting connected with other queer folks, just like Michiko was saying, like that informed my faith at that point. Like it started me on a path of unraveling a lot of really unhelpful and harmful like doctrine and theology that I had been taught or accepted, because it gave me this queer lens to look at it and go like, this is not good news for everybody. This is not good news for like folks that are experiencing direct oppression from the church or from the world. And so my queerness informed the faith that I began to reconstruct. It opened me up to like hearing from so many queer theologians that were preaching a good news, which is a very Pentecostal thing for me to say, but like it showed me that whole I was just going to say whole new world, but I didn't want to get down a Disney sing-along, but because it's not even new, right? Like we know this isn't new. This isn't something that's just happened recently. Folks have been doing this work. Black and Indigenous and other folks of color have been doing this work for centuries to actually preach the good news. So that opened a whole new world for me that led me to community, as Michiko was talking about, that I still wanted to practice my faith in community with other folks, and finding out that there were actual other like queer Christians. Like I literally thought I was the only person trying to make that happen. I didn't even know it was possible to do that. I was like, I think I'm just making something up, and there is no one else who has done this. But that's not true. There's so many, so many other queer Christians, or folks who might not even take the label as Christian, but have the history and the experience and are actually like embodying this call to justice for queer folks in the world. Don't know if that really answered the question, but I'll put that out there.
I think that answered the question pretty well. And I have some ties to you in that I've also been raised in a Pentecostal church. Were you also raised in like a really small one as well?
It wasn't so small. It's a big church now.
Okay, gotcha.
It was a medium size.
Yeah. I think I definitely resonate with that, like especially when, at least for mine was small, so people are kind of like family. So then just have the people that you want to be your family also like deny parts of who you are is very frustrating. And of course the spiritual element of having heard spiritual leaders tell you, you know, that what you are is wrong is also very it's a hard undertaking to be like a queer Christian coming out of that community. And this might be a hard question, but in contrast to that, what would your perfect Christian church space look like? I know that sounds like a really big question, but like, what does a queer affirming environment look like to you when you think of that, like the best Christian church space you could think of? Like, what is that?
Yeah, you got me with like perfect, and I was like, I don't know that there could ever be a perfect.
Yeah, I regret that wording, because I don't even believe in the concept of perfection. So the fact that I said that, I'm like, but we'll shoot for
Okay. Yeah, I think there's like a standard response of like queer affirming. If you're going to use the label affirming, it means that you believe and support queer folks being involved in ministry or every aspect of life of the church. You would support queer folks in relationships that are life-giving to them, and would bless and affirm those relationships. But as a lot of folks that I've talked with will say, like that is the bare minimum of affirming. And just because someone might let you get married there or be on a worship team or something like that, that doesn't mean they actually affirm who you are as a queer person. So for me, I think if we're shooting for the moon on what like a really great space would be, it would be like actually acknowledging that queer folks have unique gifts and that we actually want those gifts in the church, where folks are not just tokenized on a stage or on a worship team because they're a good singer or whatever, but like that their voice of what they actually want to say and what they want to call the church to is actually listened and not silenced when it calls uncomfortable things into the light. And that folks are allowed to actually be given space to lead and to have all of themselves seen and honored as like a valuable member that has like can contribute just as much as anyone else.
How about you, Michiko? What do you think your ideal church environment would look like? Shoot for the moon.
I have to say that I also had a similar reaction to Becca around this question of like what a perfect church might look like, and the wording around that when I was thinking about it, especially because for me, I see that like perfectionism and this aim for this ideal state is actually a part of white supremacy, right? And the way that we can have that come about through sort of like a rigidity of saying exactly what it needs to be. So yeah, I think rejecting that the goal of perfection is a big part of it. I mean, we look at Jesus and how he did a pretty good job of rejecting the idea of what a perfect savior is supposed to look like at his time. You know, I think that's a great model for us. I really think maybe my ideal church is one where, you know, people are able to continuously be more loyal to God than they are to the church, you know, as a building or an institution. I've been doing education around the sort of like safer space, welcoming space, affirming space, whatever language you use for many years in terms of ministry. And I think that what actually, you know, keeps people safe, makes people feel welcome is this ability to recognize that harm happens, even when we're well-intentioned, just the nature of the world that we live in and all that we are still working all the time to unlearn. And so, you know, ideally, people recognize this and start doing the work ahead of time to prevent harm by just knowing about it, really doing the work of doing institutional changes as well. But that given that this is such an ongoing project, the other piece of it is just knowing how to say, I've caused harm and I'm going to own it, I'm going to apologize, and move through those steps to really be able to hold each other. Yeah, so this ability to offer meaningful healing to people, whether it's small or large, to me is so important. Yeah, and I think like the other piece I would add for like the church as well is just to be able to engage in our faith in the way that we are church, and that acts as if God is real, you know, like God is powerful, God is transformative, God has this capacity to really mean something and transform our lives. I think so often you see people sort of doubt the ability of the church to make change. They doubt their own abilities to do good in the world, you know, but I think that if you're willing to be open to it, you know, there is so much more there that churches get themselves closed off to.
Yeah, Michiko, I have a particular question for you. We've known each other for several years, and I've often appreciated your thoughtful Facebook presence. I'm curious about kind of what I heard a different queer minister describe as kind of the fishbowl experience of being in church leadership. I remember a conversation we had a few years ago, early in your ministry, about the tension between your personal aesthetic and what's considered professional attire for a minister. And I've since seen you engaging with this in a bold, kind of playful way, you know, posting selfies of yourself at Pride with lots of glitter, with a sign saying, "This queer minister loves you." Your current profile picture captioned, "Punk clergy things," accidentally matching your hair color with your Bible. And I wonder, how would you describe some of the challenges and rewards of being a visible queer minister, perhaps particularly as a young person of color in a predominantly white and older denomination?
Thanks for your thoughtful question, Esther. We might need a whole other podcast, many hours to fully explore that sort of question. You know, it's really strange to be a queer minister because in some ways, especially in the United Church, I'm like, okay, maybe it's not a big deal. I also am just like a minister in many other rights. You know, this is one aspect of who I am in the ministry I bring. And then you have weeks like the one that we're having right now, where the Catholic Church has come out and, you know, said some really homophobic things. And you realize like I'm like wondering on social media, where are all the queer clergy? Where are their statements? Where is the stuff that's happening around this, you know? In particular Catholic clergy, or I guess not. Anyways, you know what I'm saying, right? Leadership that are able to talk to these things. And just sort of wondering, like, oh yeah, like that representation is still so essential and still matters so much in these particular conversations. But I'm also mindful of what I've learned from reading around emergent strategy, and how it's not sustainable or healthy to rely on, say, particular charismatic leadership or like a single face of a movement. So I feel like I often struggle between feeling quite isolated and lonely in that I might be the only person expressing myself in this way, but also that I'm not trying to make a name or reputation for myself as if this is a pedestal to stand on. Sort of quite opposite. It's almost like trying to be a lighthouse, like just being like, I've looked around for years, I haven't seen this. I imagine other people must feel the same way. So maybe if I do this, just be like publicly, unapologetically queer, that I will be able to find others. And then we'll be able to form community, right? Like the end goal is the connection. So yeah, and I mean, I think in some ways it is kind of working. There are lots of people that I've had a chance to meet, and I am grateful when people will just message me and be like, "Hey, I found this other queer Christian person, and you should be friends." And I'm like, "We should be. That's great." And I think what's important too is that for me, I mean, this is kind of funny. If you're watching the video, I don't look very punk at all today. But that, when I do dress that way, like it's not a costume for me. Like it is really authentic. And part of it is that if I'm going to preach about authenticity on a regular basis, I feel like I have to do what I can to show up and be authentic and to recognize the power I have as clergy. Like if I can dress like this and say, this is what Christianity can look like, then hopefully that gives permission to other people as well who want to show up in church looking the same way. So that's the hope.
I really enjoyed that answer, and hearing it is very powerful. Also, again, coming from a small church where, for example, even like dyeing your hair at all is like a color is like, no, don't do that. So to hear you say like dressing up is like very authentic to you, and like that's what's important rather than fitting into some type of mold that you need to look like is very powerful. And I also really enjoy the idea of the living apology that's on the Generous Space website. We talked a bit about it before we started recording, but I'm wondering if either of you could speak to what is meant by living apology, maybe for listeners who've never heard this concept before, within the context of Christianity and LGBTQ rights.
I think it's really coming from the goal of embodying the apology that so many LGBTQ2+2S+ folks deserve and need to hear from the church based on the harm, religious-based harm that has been perpetuated and is still happening. So when we talk about it at Generous Space, a lot of times it's a posture that is often embodied by folks who are trying to live into allyship, embodied by churches that have recognized the need, not only the need to be affirming, but have recognized the real harm that either they've been complicit in or have perpetuated in their own like church past. And the idea of like open-handedness and being someone who can hear a queer person come and say, I have experienced harm from the church, and to embody an apology to that person of that should never have happened to you. That is not what God would say about you or what God would want your lived experience to be. I am sorry. I'm so sorry that that has happened to you, and the church was wrong. I was wrong if that person has perpetuated that. And how I think for a lot of queer folks, there are like apologies we want to hear from certain people that we're never going to get. that we wish people would come to their senses or have an awakening or just realize the harm that they have done, or the silence that they have sat in instead of speaking up when they should have. And as queer folks, we might never hear from that person who harmed us or from that church we were a part of or denomination that they are sorry. And so what healing can we still facilitate? Like, what healing can we still find when the people that did us harm don't even realize it or know they did it and choose to be unrepentant, like literally to choose to not turn away from that harm and choose better? Like, when people choose to actually continue that harm, how do we find healing? How do we facilitate healing when the other party just refuses to acknowledge that pain has even or damage has been done? So I have no easy answers on that, and I think it's an individual process for folks, but the idea of being a living apology is being open to embody that for someone and to not instantly get defensive or be like, well, that wasn't me, when someone reveals that pain to us or comes to us angry that this pain has happened and we might be a representative of that to them. And just being open-handed with, yeah, like I said, like, I'm so sorry that happened, that like that should never have happened, and this is what I will do moving forward so that it doesn't happen again, or so that I don't participate in that again.
I think that that's a really good way of answering that question. And I really appreciate the way you answered it. I had a question written down that I was gonna ask next, but I think I'm gonna tweak it now based off how you answered. At least for me, I find it's very frustrating when you know there's like a part of Christianity that does have this living apology way of looking at things, and then there are still other aspects of Christianity, like Michiko mentioned earlier, where the Catholic Church put out a statement recently just reinforcing how homophobic they are. And it's like, where are all the voices that, like, where are the queer ministers? Where are those voices? And it can be a bit it's just hard to have this desire of like, I want there to be more people who are queer affirming rather than people who are oppressing queer people. And I wonder, is that something either of you experience? And if so, or are you just like focused on what you're doing? And if it is something you experience, that tension, how do you keep hope and how do you keep faith and feeling like, oh, eventually there will be more people who have this living apology framework rather than those who discriminate?
I think that I find hope in scripture, right? In the stories that are there of justice and liberation, that, you know, we actually have something in common with people that are causing harm that gives us an opportunity to say, what is going on here for you then? What is this? I find hope in the fact that there are lots of people that are not able to make public statements right now, but that are wanting to do the work, that are trying to show up and do it in the ways that feel possible for them right now. But those questions don't fully answer as well the larger picture. And I think for me, what's been really important is focusing on the spaces that are queer-led, that are by queer people, for queer people, so that we can do what feels right for us and build it up from there. You know, there is a sense of like, a lot of LGBTQ Christian folks do this like apologetics type work, right? Where they're really working on how I can prove that I fit this mold of worthiness to certain churches or within certain theologies. And for me, that's just not where I've landed. I think it can be helpful to some people in their journey, but I really find hope in just focusing on what's showing up and what's already sacred and divine within queer community and supporting that.
LGBTQ plus people.
Yeah, my partner said this a couple years ago to me when I was trying to think of like a similar answer to some kind of question. And it's something I come back to a lot that gives me hope. But they said that queerness is inevitable. And I think that gives me hope in the sense of like, if queerness is my politics, if queerness is my lens for viewing the world, and if queerness is at like its best and at its core pursuing liberation, I do have hope that that is where we're going, and that inevitably like that is where we can get to this like upside down kingdom I hear lots of like Christian folks refer to. Which seems very queer to me, and seems like that's the journey I think I'm on in following Christ. And so I just remind myself of that I think queerness is inevitable. That gives me hope.
I really like that. So a follow-up question on that. Generous Space is unique among the LGBTQ plus affirming Christian organizations that I know of in that it simultaneously works to create life-giving community spaces for LGBTQ plus Christians and explicitly welcomes people who are not fully prepared to embrace affirming theologies. So maybe Becca, if you'd like to start, I am super curious about how that works.
Better some days than others. It's a tension that we're always working in, and I think I want to draw the distinction between LGBTQ plus folks who themselves have discerned for their own life, maybe that they feel called to celibacy, or they have landed on a non-affirming theology, versus folks that I was going to say allies, but I don't think they're allies, versus cishet folks that want to impose that on queer folks or want to demand that. And there's a difference there. And so I think we don't give spotlight and voice to those folks that are imposing this on queer folks as a whole. And so I think that is a difference versus making space for queer folks themselves who have arrived at their own theological positions for their lives. I think we do a lot of talking about our role in community together is not to convince each other to act and think a certain way, which means we do have to leave that space, but it doesn't mean that we don't challenge each other when harm is being done or when harmful theologies are coming to the surface, that we do need to have those discussions, but we aren't trying to replicate some of the church systems that some of us have grown up in that say you must believe these 5 points in order to like come to our pub theology night, like or whatever it is. Yeah, maybe I'll just pause because I'm thinking more. Maybe, I don't know if Michiko has any thoughts.
Yeah, I think this does go back to like the name of the organization being Generous Space. And that for many people, this generous space is one that they've arrived at after experiencing a lot of harm, maybe years, maybe their whole life, born and raised in a particular cultural or theological context, and that it takes a lot of work to do that unpacking to figure out what healing may look like, especially if you haven't necessarily been given permission to develop your own theologies and to think for yourself. And so I think we do a disservice to the people that we are trying to serve the most when we create certain forms of gatekeeping or expectations, right? Like when we can be very generous in who we welcome, then we welcome the possibilities for so much more grace and transformation in people's lives. So I think that that's why it's really important. I think about my own experiences doing this work, even beyond generous space, where I welcomed allies into the space, right? Like who should be in and out of, queer spaces, only to notice that this was someone who needed that opportunity to step into a queer space in order to come out, right? So I've often found that the times when I've been able to be most generous with my welcome to people in the space that they need, that has been to the benefit of myself and to the community, and certainly that person as well.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really helpful clarification, that the important part is, not expecting people to share certain theological beliefs, but giving people space to make their own, to make their own meanings in a way that's respectful of other people's choices. That very, that is so related to the question in, activism and social change work in general, of how we change things without taking on some of the qualities of the systems that we want to dismantle.
I agree with everything that Esther said, and I think I've learned a lot already with all the questions that have been answered, especially with the question in being, I feel like, a reimagining of the question of like perfection and what does a perfect church look like, and seeing how that can be like, I've never thought of the sense of perfection. I always knew there was something wrong with that word, but I never thought of seeing the link there between that and white supremacy. So that was a really interesting thing to bring up. And I highly value and appreciate all of the answers that you've both offered to us today. And I wanted to offer this last question, which is, how can listeners support you two and Generous Space? Are there any social media accounts, for example, that you'd like people to follow, or any projects that you're working on and would like people to know about?
I can just give the where to find us kind of pitch. You can find us at generousspace.ca, and we're on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook at Generous Space, all spelt out. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd also say if you check out the website, there are contact information for the staff. So if you want to get more involved with any of the programming or want to connect someone you know to that programming, then you can always just shoot us an email and we can do that sort of piece from there.
Hey, Michiko and Becca, thank you so much for joining us today. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And thank you to our listeners as well. I'm looking forward to connecting next time.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Spirits Rising. You can watch us on YouTube or listen to us at anchor.fm, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Our thanks to the Student Christian Movement for supporting this project, and especially to the SCM York chapter's partnership with St. Theodore of Canterbury Anglican Church and the Diocese of Toronto's REACH grant.